Hello, I'm recording the lesson for Wednesday, November 1st, chapter 18. We're going to start with the open economy. We've actually already looked at the open economy because when we did the aggregate demand, aggregate supply models, we looked at it as an open economy. Remember, the only time we removed the concept of net exports was when we looked at the parity between savings and investments. So now we're going to reintroduce that. We're going to reintroduce net exports and see how that savings and investment parity works out and how the trade balance, so a deficit or surplus, affects the flow of funds in and out of the USA and the purchase of US assets. So when we're talking assets, we're not talking goods and services. We're talking more like financial assets. So originally, we in the closed economy, I said we don't have an economy that interacts with the world, right? Like, say, for example, North Korea. The US is an open economy. It's an economy that interacts with other economies around the world, buys and sells goods and services in world product markets, and we sell and buy capital assets, so stocks, bonds in financial markets. So this is the parity we're going to look at today. There is a parity and there is an equilibrium between the goods and the services that we sell and buy in world markets and the stocks and the bonds that we buy and sell in world markets. And if you stop a second to think about it, it makes perfect sense. Every time that we buy goods and services from another country, there is a flow of money. So money is sort of part of the financial markets, right? The money goes in and out of the country every time we purchase and sell goods in and out of the country, every time we have imports and exports. So the flow of goods, when we have exports, the goods and the services leave the United States. The goods are produced in the USA, but we're selling them abroad, right? We're selling them outside of the USA. When we import goods, the goods and services are produced in another country, but they're sold in the USA. So the exports affect our GDP, correct? We produce it in the USA. It doesn't matter where we sell them to be part of our GDP. Imports do not affect. They affect our GDP in the sense that we're not buying domestically produced goods, right? We're buying foreign produced goods. They're produced abroad and we're buying it for our consumption. So when we look at the GDP and how the trade affects the GDP, the gross product, everything that is produced in our country in the year, we call it net exports. Exports minus imports. The trade balance in the US, we all know, has been negative for the longest time. That means that the imports exceed the exports. We import more than what we export. So let's look at it. I'm going to skip the active learning for the video, but if you open the PowerPoint in the classroom, I'm going to load it under the modules and you open it up. If you want to test yourself, you can go through the active learning. I'm just not going to do it because I don't have a whiteboard that I can write off on while I have the PowerPoint open. So I'll just keep the examples. What influence net exports, right? Net exports can be influenced by taste. Something that becomes trendy, we might decide to import, export, something that becomes trendy abroad, right? Net exports are not just influenced by what happens in the USA, they're influenced by what happens abroad. If a US product becomes very trendy, think of, for example, Levi's. When there was a boom of jeans, then they would buy more US made jeans. We export more of them. It reduces our trade deficit for at least the jeans. Exports and imports are affected by the prices of goods at home and abroad. If something is cheaper, if purchased from abroad, we're going to buy that one, right? We import goods from China. They cost a little less, so we tend to buy what is less expensive if everything is the same, right? We're going to be biased by price. Exchange rates. The exchange rates affect the price that we pay for goods and services. The value of our currency, the US currency, compared to the value of currencies abroad is going to affect the price that the consumer pays. So exchange rates are going to affect imports and exports, the incomes of consumers at home and abroad. If there's a rise in income in the US, we can spend more money. We might buy more imported goods. If incomes of other countries goes up or down. So if a country, for example, is experiencing a recession, they will import less goods, which means that US will export less to that country. We will not be selling as much to that country because they're experiencing a recession. The same will happen. Obviously, if the US experiences a recession, it's going to alter our trade balance depending on the prices of goods. We would be buying less goods in general. We might buy less imported goods. We're going to buy the cheaper goods. Transportation costs. This has been a big issue. Think of post-COVID. Besides the transportation costs, all the transportation issues have actually affected, obviously, trade balances around the world because there were all the supply issues and the costs of supplying government policies towards international trade. So imposing tariffs, quotas that we've already seen can affect the amount of goods demanded by domestically by citizens, because it makes the price go up if we impose a tariff. If there's embargoes, there's just trade limitation enforced because there's diplomatic issues that might cause those limitations. Now, when we talk of our trade balance, obviously, if our exports exceed the imports, we're going to have a positive trade balance. That means we're going to have a trade surplus, right? We are selling more goods and services abroad than what we're buying from other countries. The trade deficit, which is what the US is experiencing right now, means that NX is negative. We are importing more goods than what we are exporting to other countries. And so when we talk of the trade balance, in general, we're talking of the difference between exports and imports. And if that trade balance is positive, we're exporting more. If it's negative, we're importing more. And then if it's balanced trade, it means that exports equal imports. And there has been a time when this might have been true in the US, but obviously it is not true right now. As you can see from this graph from Fred, the US has not always had a negative trade balance. So we haven't always had a deficit. Look up back here in the 50s, our imports were less than our exports, and just some time here, see in the mid 70s, they've kind of matched for a while. Through the 80s, there was more protectionism policies during this time. For example, we were limiting the import of vehicles for Japan and other things, and then it kind of went down, and then they've kind of inverted, and our imports have become higher than our exports. And so we've had this trade balance, if you can see just around here, which would be from the mid 80s. So it has not been negative forever. It's just been negative for the last 40 years. Now let's go look at the other side of the coin, which is the financial flow, right? We said every time we purchase something, we're actually using money to buy and sell the goods that we're importing and exporting. So there's a capital flow of money and assets in and out of the USA, right? So the capital flow is the purchase or sale of foreign asset by domestic residents. It can be a foreign direct investment or a foreign portfolio investment. Remember, we talked about how foreigners can invest in other countries. A foreign direct investment is if you're, say, opening if the big McDonald's franchise goes to another country, opens a restaurant in that country, it's a foreign direct investment. But then there's foreign portfolio investments, which is literally the purchase of stocks and bonds on foreign markets. So Europeans can come to can go on the market. Now you do it all digitally online. You can go and you can purchase stocks and bonds from the US stock market, Americans can go and buy stocks and bonds on any market in the world. So when we talk of net capital outflow, I know we call it outflow, but it's literally the flow. So the net capital flow or net capital outflow, NCO, it's the net foreign investment, which is the purchase of foreign assets by domestic residents minus the purchase of domestic assets by foreigners. So instead of speaking import and exports of goods and services, we're talking of purchases of domestic U.S. assets by foreigners and the purchase of foreign assets by domestic users, by U.S. residents, basically. So it's the same thing. We're just replacing goods and services with assets, right? With financial assets. When we have a capital outflow, it means that the net capital outflow is bigger than zero. It means that U.S. people, the people in the U.S., are buying more foreign assets than foreigners are buying U.S. assets. Okay, so if we had to pick a country, obviously, let's say Italy, if it was just country to country, not on a global level, our net capital outflow would be positive if U.S. residents are buying more Italian assets than Italians are buying, for example, U.S. assets, right? So the U.S. is spending more money. The capital is going out of the country, outflow. The money is going out, right? NCO is bigger than zero. When the net capital outflow is less than zero, then we're saying that the money is coming into the country. The foreigners are buying more U.S. assets. When does that happen? If our stock exchange is doing really good, right? And then they might be buying more foreign assets in the U.S. because they're giving good interest rates, they're getting good deals on it. But it could also depend on the exchange rate, right? If we have a lower exchange rate, so it's more convenient to buy U.S. assets, they might buy more. They might buy more U.S. assets with foreign money. The same would go with if our currency is stronger, U.S. people can buy more abroad, right? So the capital outflows when the net capital outflow is positive, and the capital is inflowing, coming in when the net capital outflow is negative, which it means that the capital is coming in, basically. And we do need that capital to come in. So we need that net capital outflow to be negative when it is negative, and we'll find out why, because there's a really important identity in an open economy between net capital outflow and net exports. What influences net capital outflow? So this movement of financial assets. Real interest rates paid on foreign assets and real interest rates paid on domestic assets. The higher the interest rate, the higher the rate of return. We're talking real interest rate, obviously, because it has to be adjusted for inflation. Inflation can be different. The price level is not always the same in all countries. Perceived economic and political risk. We talked about of holding foreign assets. So we talked about the stability of a country. The political stability of a country is really important in deciding whether you're going to make an investment in that country, whether you're going to buy assets, right, if it's safe. Government policies that affect foreign ownership of domestic assets. For example, could foreigners be, if you're taxed more, right? Government policy, it might discourage foreign ownerships and foreign investments into other countries. So government policies, economic and political risk, and the real interest rates paid on domestic assets and foreign assets all influence the way the capital flows back in and out of a country. So now we come to this identity, and we call it an accounting identity, right? There's no other economic factors that affect it but the numbers. Every transaction that will affect net exports, so every export and every import, will also affect the net capital outflow by the same amount and vice versa, right? If you purchase a good from the USA will export, and the net exports will increase if we're exporting a U.S. good. The foreigners will pay that foreign good with assets or currency, right? So in the moment you're paying, the US is acquiring some foreign assets, which also causes the net capital outflow to rise, right? It'll go up because we are acquiring foreign assets. We talked about the foreign assets purchased by us. We're getting those assets, basically. We're receiving them through the sale of goods and services. So the net capital flow will increase. Oops, sorry. That wasn't supposed to happen. Too fast. So remember this identity, net capital outflow equals net exports. So we looked at what happens when U.S. exports increase. The net export increases, obviously. It's negative, it's going to be less negative. Then the net capital outflow rises, right? And it because there is this entrance of foreign assets into the U.S. There's that inflow. Now, when a U.S. citizen buys foreign goods, that affects imports. When imports rise, we're going to have a decrease in net exports. So the U.S. buyer pays with U.S. dollars or assets, right? So the other country is acquiring U.S. assets. And that what happens when the money is going out of the country, there's that net capital outflow. The net capital outflow is going to fall. It's going to go down. So they move in the same direction. When there's an increase in net exports, we know there's going to be an increase in net capital outflow. When there's a decrease in net exports, we know there's going to be a decrease in net capital outflow. So let's run an example real quick. Kiara is a web designer living in Illinois. I swear I didn't choose the name. Professor Mankiw did, or his assistants. She creates and sells a website to Gabrielle, who is living in Germany. So this is a service, right? She lives in Illinois and she's selling a website. She's selling a service to someone living in Germany. So if we're selling a service to Germany, it's an export. Gabrielle pays Chiara 5,000 euros for the website. What is the effect on the U.S. net exports and the net capital outflow? So if we're selling a website, we're exporting. If we're exporting, our net exports will increase, right? So what happens to the net capital outflow? We can already know that it's going to increase because they move in the same direction. But what happens to net exports and net capital outflow if? So there's different scenarios. Chiara keeps the 5,000 euros at home. Chiara buys 5,000 euros worth of stocks in a German company. Chiara spends the 5,000 euros on shoes made in Germany. So in this, it's importing, right, the shoes. Chiara exchanges the 5,000 euros into US dollars. So there's these four scenarios and we can look at what's going to happen. I've already given away the answer for C, right? Because she's going to import. But let's look at the individual answers. Chiara sells the website to Gabrielle in Germany. So we're going to have net exports that are going to go up, right? Because they're exporting the website. Net capital outflow has to go up. There's a purchase of foreign assets by domestic residents minus the purchases of domestic assets by the foreigners, right? The website sold to Gabrielle is an export. It goes up. The U.S. exports and the net exports will increase. So what's happening to the net capital outflow? So in this scenario, we know that the U.S. exports and the net exports are going to increase. So now let's go look what happens in the different scenario. If she keeps the 5,000 euros at home, so she's in Illinois and keeping this money at home, she has acquired a foreign asset. She has acquired 5,000 euros, so the net capital outflow will increase because exports increase. The net NX has increased also. If she buys 5,000 euros worth of stocks in a German company, right? So now she is using those 5,000 euros to acquire a foreign asset, right? So she still, whether it's currency, whether it's a stock, makes no difference. She acquired 5,000 euros in a foreign asset, so net capital outflow increases it anyways. So it doesn't make any difference whether you keep the money at home or whether you buy stocks in a German company, though specifically, right? So in those two scenarios, net capital outflow increases by those $5,000 in the same way the net exports have increased. So remember these examples for, getting through the examples in the homework. Now, what if she spends the 5,000 euros on German shoes? She purchases shoes made in Germany, it becomes an import. So she exported $5,000, but she also she imported $5,000 of shoes. Our net exports have not changed because we have the same amount of export and imports. She acquired the euros, but then she spent those euros, so that net capital outflow also did not change because the money came and it went. So zero. This scenario evened itself out. What if she exchanges the 5,000 euros into US dollars? Now the bank has to use 5,000 euros kept in the vault, or purchase German assets, or they have to sell the euros to an American that wants to purchase goods and services from euros. So the change in the net export is matched by the change in the net capital outflow, which means that depending on what the bank will do, it will affect both net exports and net capital outflow, right? If she exchanges the 5,000 euros into US dollars, what's going to happen? If the bank keeps it in the vault, the bank has acquired those 5,000 euros. So there's still that 5,000 euros of foreign assets that has increased in the US as a whole, right? But if, say, the bank gives if it gives the euros to an American to purchase goods and services for euros, then there's going to be an increase of the purchase, right? Of the imports, a decrease in the foreign assets acquired because the American is going to use those euros to give back to Europe, which is going to even out the balance of trade. So we're going to be back to a balance of zero between exports and imports. I know D can be a little bit more tricky kind of scenario, but it's kind of like the one where she decides to buy the shoes. I'll leave you to go through the example of imports from China, but it's exactly the same reasoning. When we're exporting, we're receiving the money from the foreign country, right? If we're importing, it means we're purchasing from the China. So we're getting the goods and the services into the US. Our net exports are going to go down because we have imports. And what's going to happen? The money is leaving the US and it's going to China. So China is acquiring US assets, US currency, and therefore their net capital outflow, our net capital outflow is also going to decrease, right? Because imports will decrease our net exports, net capital outflow will decrease also because the money is leaving. A foreign resident is acquiring U.S. assets. In this case, currency is the asset. So this example works exactly in the same way than the import example, and I'll let you go through it. You can look at it, but it's a parallel to the other one. So now let's look, right? We always talk about the trade deficit. We looked at the impact of the budget deficit and how it can affect the U.S. economy. Is it good? Is it bad? What's bad about it? And what should we worry about? Well, what happens in the U.S.? In the U.S., we have a trade deficit, right? Is it good? Is it bad? What happens? So what happens, for example, if we're running a trade surplus? So if we're running a trade surplus, it means that our net capital our net exports are bigger than zero, and it means that the net capital outflow is also bigger than zero. What does that mean? It means that our money is going out of the country. Well, how can that happen? This can happen only if we have so many savings that we can lend money abroad. It means we have an excess of loanable funds. So remember, we talked of those loanable funds, which there's the supply of money, the savings that we have that leaves the country, and then we have the investment, right? The need for loans, like the businesses in the market for loanable funds. So if we have too many loanable funds, we have too much savings per se, then that money is going to flow out. We're going to go invest that money, use that money abroad because our savings are bigger than our investments. So if a country is running a trade surplus, we're selling more goods and services to foreigners, right? We can use the foreign currency we use that foreign currency it receives for net sales. So the money is changing hands. The exports are going out, and we're receiving all those foreign assets. The capital is flowing out of the country. When we have that trade deficit, the country, we have their net exports are going to be below zero. That means the net capital outflow is going to be below zero. That means our investments are bigger than our savings. Our savings are less. We're not saving enough. The investments also, are bigger. The need for funds to invest are greater than what our country is saving, right? So we need that foreign money, basically. So the capital is flowing into the country. There's foreign money coming in. Simple example is during the trade deficit, budget deficit also, the government will to fund the trade deficit, right? Because the funds are going in and out. So just imagine these funds going in and out, not so much as my transaction at every store of paying the money, because we're talking of funds going between countries, right? So the country owes money to another country. When the U.S. is importing, for example, cotton towels from Turkey, it's having to pay Turkey. It owes Turkey money, right, for those towels coming in. And we're talking of a country. Obviously, every business imports, but we're talking what the country owes because we're importing and exporting as a country. So we owe that money, and there's all these balances. There's the balance of the goods and services, and then there's the financial balance of this money that changes hands, not physically, right? It changes hand digitally. So we owe this money, and we need to find this money. We need to fund it, right? So the money flows in and out of this country. So we're running, if we're running this trade deficit, we're importing more than we're exporting. Our net capital outflow will be negative. The money is flowing into the country because we have a deficit, basically. We're selling these assets abroad. We're selling bonds and stocks abroad, and we have capital flowing into our country. We have that currency coming into our country. So we know we have a deficit when the net capital outflow is also negative. Because we're looking at it, if we have a net exports means net capital outflow is negative. But so if you have a question where it tells you that our net capital outflow is negative, then you know we have a trade deficit. You can do it the other way. If NCO is less than zero, then NX is less than zero. Because it's just a mathematical and it's an accounting equation that always holds true, basically. So how does this relate to our savings and investments? We said that savings always equal investments, right? But we had taken out the net export figure from the picture. Now we can reintroduce it in an open economy. We can say that our total income and expenditure equals consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. National savings will equal, right? Will equal the total income minus consumption minus government spending. That's our national savings, right? So we're not making the distinction between private and public, but the whole country's savings. We can also say that because that our total expenditure minus consumption minus government spending equals investments plus net export. Look at the first equation, right? If I take these two out and put them on one side, then all there's, if I take the total income, consumption, and government spending out, then all I have left is investment and net export. So savings equals investment and net export. It's just an identity, right? If I say that this is my equation for savings, total expenditure, total income minus consumption minus government spending, and I say that this group equals investments plus net exports, then by definition, savings will be equal to investment plus net exports. So in an open economy, savings is not equal to investments only. Now we have to introduce those net exports. Why do we introduce the net exports? Because net exports are equal to net capital outflow, right? So because we know that, we can also say that our savings is equal to domestic investment. So the money U.S. individuals spend to purchase, make investments in the U.S., plus the net capital outflow, so the purchase of U.S. assets by foreigners. Basically, the net purchase of U.S. assets by foreigners. So that is a really important identity for the savings. In this case, we just have added this other element to the equation. When we have a trade surplus, we said exports are greater than imports. The net exports are positive. Total expenditure is Y, or, total output is greater than domestic spending. Savings is greater than income. And net capital outflow is greater than 0 also. You can derive all this from these by looking at this equation. It's all when you run it through. When we have net exports being positive, right? If net exports are a positive number, then our savings are going to be greater than our investments because we have investments plus net exports. So we know in this case, if we have a trade surplus, savings is going to be greater than investments. When savings are greater than investments, we said we have an excess of loanable funds. These funds in excess flow abroad, and that's why we have a net capital outflow greater than 0. If we have a trade deficit, so we import more than we export, then we can say that savings is smaller than investments. When the savings is smaller than investments, the foreigners are financing some of the country's investments. And that is why our net capital outflow is going to be negative, because it's foreigners financing some of the country's investment. When this is negative, right, we call it inflow. When it's positive, let me spell it out. This way we're not confused. I can't find 0. Then we have outflow, remember? Just to put it all in perspective. So is this trade deficit that we have a bad thing? The U.S. trade deficit, is it a national problem? This is a case study. You can read it off your book, but I'm quickly going to go through it, not in much detail. I would prefer for you to read it because it makes more sense than reading than looking at bullet points. But before the 1980s, savings and investments fluctuated together. What does that mean? It means that we had a small net capital outflow and savings and investment were pretty much the same, right? Remember when we looked at that chart here and we looked at import and exports, see? We're very similar. We didn't have a big trade deficit up until the mid-80s here, right? So this is what we're looking for. What does this mean? Is savings and investments pretty much stayed the same, because savings and investments are not going to be the same anymore when the net exports is going to be a big negative or a big positive number, right? So what happened up until the 80s? Let me go back to here. We did not have, they fluctuated together. But then after the 1980s, the savings started being smaller than the investments. What does that mean? That the net exports were negative, right? We started having more import than exports, and so savings started being smaller than investments. When savings are smaller than investment, it means we're running a trade deficit. So we had sizable trade deficits and inflow of capital, foreign investments in the US, basically. And so our net capital outflow, it was a large negative number. If we have a large negative trade deficit, then we're going to have a large negative net capital outflow. So in the 1980s and 1980 through the 80s, we had the unbalanced fiscal policy. What does that mean? We had a fall in national savings. Why? Because we had an increase in the budget deficit. So Reaganomics was all about reducing the deficit, decreasing government spending, trying to push the economy forward. We had high inflation, high interest rates. But what really happened is defense spending was very high in the 1980s. So Reagan's administration was not able to keep that promise of reducing government spending and trying to reduce the budget deficit yearly. And ever since the 80s, and then, not ever since the 80s, but all through the 80s, we had an increasing budget deficit and an increasing, that budget deficit had to be funded, right? And so that affected the trade deficit also, and we just had this negative net capital outflow. Then in the 90s, this changed a bit because we had investment booms in the 1990s. So our both savings and investment increased. So we did a little better. We had budget surpluses in the government. We had information technology, right? We have the technology boom. So we did pretty well in the 90s in terms of budgeting and then trade deficit. And then we move to the 2000s. The 2000s, we had the 9/11 attack. We started the war in Afghanistan. We moved into the recession, 2007, 2009 recession. Then as it took a while to get the economy back going, and as the economy's back going, boom, we were hit again by, as we recovered in those 10 years, the savings and investment increased, and then we were hit by COVID, which saw again a really big increase in government spending. And so again, we did not do so well on our budget deficits, and there was another decline in national savings. And so again, large budget deficit, lower national savings, it affected trade also. So just look how everything is linked together. We were looking at trade deficit. We said it affects net capital outflow. But then again, when we have that budget deficit, it needs to be funded somewhere. We're selling assets. We're selling those stocks and bonds to fund that deficit, right? And who owns those stocks and the bonds? They can be owned by U.S. citizens, but they can also be owned by foreign citizens. So this is pretty much what happened, is that in the 80s, we had this trade deficit by a fall in savings. The nation put away less of its income to provide it for its future. Trade deficit by the investment boom of the 90s. The economy is borrowing from abroad to finance the purchase of new capital goods. So even if we had those budget surplus, we were still having that we had that trade deficit. And we can look at it, how the investments, we can see when they were matching more at the beginning of the 90s, when they're meeting. So when they're closer, but then investments are higher than savings. So what does that mean? When that equation, savings equal investments plus net exports. If investments are higher than the savings in the equation, that it means the net exports are eroding, right? That equation, right? And that investment is higher minus the net exports, we get the savings. And you can see a matching in the net capital outflow, because the way the net exports trend, that is how the net capital outflow has been trending also. So we've had this decrease in net capital outflow, which means that when the net capital outflow is negative, right, below zero. So look at this line. So they've been below zero in the 70s. It went up a bit. Then in the 80s, it went really down. Oops, sorry. And then it went a little bit up in the beginning of the 90s, and then it really dipped here with the recession. It went up, then it kind of 2019 through 2019 to 2022, there's this dip caused by COVID, but it's below zero. We have capital inflow, right? The investments are bigger than the savings. we are experiencing a bigger deficit for trade deficit. So is this bad or good? Like, how do we figure this out? It's not necessarily a problem to have a trade deficit, as it says here. It's a symptom of a problem, right? It could be a symptom, but also what does it mean is that the funds, the way the funds are going, it puts us in a position of debt. The people abroad owned $51 trillion and plus of U.S. assets. The U.S. residents own $34 trillion in foreign assets. So when the money is flowing, we owe the money to 51.75 minus 34 trillion. We are in debt to other countries by $17.75 trillion. So the U.S. is considered the world's biggest debtor nation. We're not looking this in terms of percentage of the GDP and percentage of the economy. We're looking at only in percentage of trillions of dollars. So we're the world's biggest debtor when it comes to the money that we owe other countries because of the way the assets, right? The U.S. residents do not own a lot of foreign assets because we don't save enough to own foreign assets. If we saved more, we would buy more foreign assets. We would owe less to the rest of the world. So think about this also when we talk about the money that, that only 1% that we give in foreign aid is really not that much, when in terms of net capital outflow, we actually are in the negative and not in the positive. So that's another perspective sometimes. The U.S. is still the biggest economy in the world. It's one of the strongest economies in the world. That trade deficit is not necessarily a problem, but it puts us in that position of debt. There's a lot of, other countries that owning our assets. So moving on, what affects trade, right? Exchange rates. We said one of the things that can affect trade is prices, the price level in a country, but also the exchange rate. If the exchange rate, the currency, the value of the currency changes, it will affect how much those goods and services cost to foreign citizens, and it affects how much they cost to us. So that is a really important factor to consider in international trade. So the nominal exchange rate is the rate at which you can trade the currency from one country to the other. Literally, when you go look at the currency exchange rate, if you went and looked at the exchange rate today, then that would be your nominal exchange rate, right? It's exactly like the nominal interest rate that you get charged on goods. Like, it's not adjusted for anything. So, for example, in 21 August 2022, the Canadian dollar for $1 Canadian dollar, 1.29 Canadian dollars for a dollar. Euro, 0.99 euros for a dollar. The euro is always a little bit stronger than the dollar is. Japanese yen, 136.86 yens for a dollar. Mexican peso, 20.17 for a dollar. So for those of you who come from abroad, like France, Austria, you guys can go look it up. What is the exchange rate for a US dollar? Kind of to see the nominal exchange rate. And you can go compare then what the real exchange rate is, because the real exchange rate takes this nominal exchange rate as it is and then compares it to the price level, right? Because we can't really know what is the purchasing power of this dollar. If I change a dollar and I have 1.29 Canadian dollars and I go to Canada, right? What can I buy with that dollar in the US? What can I buy with that dollar in Canada? What costs $1.29? And depending on the price level in each country, it will affect what I can buy. It will affect the purchasing power of that dollar. And it does affect basically the real exchange rate, right? The real exchange rate is how many units of output I can purchase. If a dollar appreciates, if a currency appreciates, it means that it increases in value. So if we say the US dollar appreciates, in this case, for example, the $1 was 99 cents of a euro. If you can get €1 for $1, then the dollar has appreciated. If we can only get 80 cents of a euro, 80 cents euro for $1, then the dollar has depreciated. We can buy less euros with it, right? So that is how we talk of appreciation and depreciation. What is the and so weakness or strength of a currency? How much can that dollar purchase? Is it stronger? Is it less strong? The real exchange rate, it's the rate at which a person can trade the goods and services, right? From one country to the other. So we're looking at it in terms of goods and services. How much goods and services can I buy with $1? That is the real exchange rate. It's not, regardless of basically the exchange rate. Like we're adjusting, we're looking at the level of the prices. So we can look at the price as the domestic price of one good and the foreign price of one good. And then we use the nominal exchange rate. So for the first example would be, how much does a Big Mac cost? If it costs $4 in the US and it costs 380 yen in Japan, is it the same price? How do we compare that? So we'll get an exchange rate and we say $1 is 110 yen. We compute the exchange rate. First of all, we can get the nominal exchange rate, which is $10. We multiply it by P, which is the price, domestic price. So the $4. Let's compare the exchange rate of 110 yen by $4. We can say that in terms of the price in yen of a US Big Mac is 440 yen. In Japan, it's 380 yen. So we already know it costs more in the US. The real exchange rate is given by the relationship between the two prices, right? The price in Japan and the price in the US. So now I can do 110. I can do 4 divided 380. Or I can do 440 yen divided 380 yen. And it's 1.16. So Japanese Big Macs for 1 US. So with $4, this is what this means. For $4, I can buy more than one Big Mac in Japan. I can buy 1.16 of a Big Mac for every Big Mac in the US. That's what the real exchange rate is the amount of money. So I spend in the US, how much does it purchase abroad by comparing the same good? The Big Mac is the best example, right? Because it's one corporation that has restaurants everywhere. So why doesn't a Big Mac cost the same everywhere around the world? And this brings up another discussion, is the power parity, right? The parity between prices why doesn't a Big Mac cost everywhere around the world? And we'll see why it doesn't. And it doesn't because the exchange rates change, the real exchange rate changes, the price level changes between countries. I'll let you do the to do the active learning. You can try it yourself, right? So if the exchange rate is 20 pesos per dollar, so we're doing pesos, the price of a tall Starbucks latte is $3 in the US, 40 pesos in Mexico, right? What is the price of a US latte measured in pesos? So we're doing the same thing. We're multiplying that 20 pesos by the 3 US dollars. We know that, and we can say it's what? 2 times 60 pesos. In Mexico, it costs 4, right? So you can go look, 60 pesos for a US latte. Then we're going to divide that by the 40 pesos. So if you can buy 1.5 lattes in Mexico with the $3 that you have in the US, if that makes any sense. So if I had $3 and I have to decide, am I buying an American latte or am I buying a Mexican latte? I can buy 1 latte in the US. I can buy 1.5 lattes in Mexico. So this is kind of what it means with those same $3. So it means it costs less in Mexico. But that is how you figure out the real exchange rate, the amount of goods and services that you can buy with the money. So now let's convert that. Now we looked at the individual prices, but we can look at the prices as a price level, right? So instead of looking at it, the $3, $4, let's use the price level. And we're going to compare the price level, right? The price of the domestic basket of goods and services. So here again, we get a use for the CPI to calculate the real exchange rate. So we use the P is the price, US price level, the consumer price index for the US. And the P with the star is going to be the foreign price level. If the US real exchange rate appreciates, right? So our currency becomes stronger. there's a strength of the U.S. currency, our U.S. goods become more expensive. If U.S. goods become more expensive, what happens? We're going to export less. This is why we want to know the exchange rates. We want to figure out the real exchange rate, because that is what's when we use the price level, then we're going to know if those exports and imports are going to be more expensive or less expensive. And here comes the purchasing power parity theory, right? We said, why don't all goods cost the same? Why doesn't that Big Mac, it's a big corporation, why doesn't it cost $4 everywhere? Why does it cost less in Japan? Why doesn't the Starbucks latte cost the same everywhere? Why does it cost less in Mexico? Because I can buy 1.5 lattes versus one latte in the US. So this is the theory of exchange rate, right? That it doesn't matter in what currency we look at things, a unit of a currency, so $1, right, should be able to buy the same quantity of goods everywhere. Law of one price. A good should be the same price everywhere, especially if it's sold by the same company and the same corporation, right? Why doesn't a Big Mac cost the same price everywhere? The theory of arbitrage says that if there is a price difference between markets, then you can take advantage of that price difference. If coffee beans are more expensive in one country versus the other, then you can buy those coffee beans at a lower price, resell them at a higher price somewhere else. And you can keep doing that until the supply and demand will even out the price. It will come back in equilibrium, and then we're going to then we're going to reach that purchasing power parity again. There's going to be that law on one price, and definitely this is what this theory is based off. Because of arbitrage, because of the purchase and sale of the goods that cost less somewhere and cost more somewhere else, the price is different in two countries. You buy and sell until though there is an equilibrium reached, and the price is the same in both countries. Remember, we talked of arbitrage with the loans of the federal funds rate. The federal funds rate move from bank to bank until it settles on an exchange rate, on a federal funds rate, which is the federal funds rate that the Federal Reserve targeted. So through arbitrage, we reach the equilibrium on the federal funds rate. The same thing happens with the prices in exchanges here. So with the law of one price, if the coffee beans sell for £4 in Seattle, £5 in Boston, so we do it in the same price, in the same country, just to explain the arbitrage, right? The coffee beans can be costlessly transported. In this example in the model, we simplify the models. You would buy the coffee beans in Seattle for £4, and you would sell them in Boston for £5, right? So the opportunity of arbitrage, making a quick profit, you buy it in one place, sell it in the other. But what happens in Seattle? As you're buying more and more coffee, there's an increase in demand. That increase in demand, there's going to be a shift in the demand curve, right? The demand curve is going to shift to the right. So if you look at the demand and supply equilibrium and you shift the curve to the right, it increases the prices. So as the demand for coffee increases, the price goes up until it reaches the $5 a pound that you have in Boston. At the same time in Boston, increasing the supply drives the price down. If you get a supply curve and you shift it to the right, the price goes down, right? So the shift to the demand in Seattle, the shift in supply in Boston will eventually bring an equilibrium, and the price of coffee between Seattle and Boston will settle somewhere in between the £4 or £5, but it will end up being the same price. And so this is what the arbitrage means, and the arbitrage supports the theory of the purchasing power parity, right? It's the same. So according to this theory, a currency must have the same purchasing power in every country. The US dollar can buy the same quantity of goods. It can buy the same Big Mac in the US. In Japan, it can buy the same Starbucks quantity in the US and in Mexico, because it has the same real value, right? We're talking of real value, the amount of goods, the units of goods that we can buy everywhere in the country. So if we use this theory, a dollar buys the same quantity of goods in the United States as in Sweden for example. So what is the exchange rate if a bushel of apples sells for $30 in the US and 300 krona in Sweden? What is the exchange rate? We know that we can derive the nominal exchange rate, which is 300 kronas divided the $30. The nominal exchange rate is 10 krona dollar. How did we reach this? Because we used this equation. We have P and we have P with the star. So we divide the two, right? Inverted. Now we're dividing P with the star by P, and we'll have E. Exactly, because that's what we know. We know the relationship between the prices. We just didn't know the nominal exchange rate. And that is how. So we divided 300 kronas by the $30. So the exchange rate, the nominal exchange rate was 10 kronas per dollar, if there was this power parity. What would that mean if this theory was always the same? Is that the purchasing power of the dollar is always the same home and abroad? Then there would be no change in the real exchange rate. That would also mean that the price level never changes, because this relationship would always be the same, right? Because we know that the nominal exchange rate equals the relationship between the price level. That means that inflation moves the same in both countries always. Is that true? That is not always true, but that is the implication of the PPP theory, is that the domestic price level will always move in the same direction as the foreign price level to be so that nominal exchange rate never changes, right? The other implication is that the nominal exchange rate would change with the price levels change. It means that when a central bank in a country increases money supply, for example, the price level rises, it can cause the country's currency to depreciate relative to other currencies in the world. Well, this is an implication that is true, because when central banks change the money supply, they're changing the interest rate. That change in interest rate does affect the currency level. The value of the currency does appreciate or depreciate the currency level. So this implication of the power parity is one that can occur. What are the limitations? It doesn't always hold true. Not always the goods are easily traded, right? You can't arbitrage away price differences. Why? Because in the model, we said that the transportation was costless. Transportation is not costless, right? So the prices are not going to always level out between countries for a good, like Big Macs. You're not going to buy the Big Macs and bring them to the US to sell them for more, because you have to transport them. Coffee beans have to be transported. So that is, arbitrage is not, when it comes to goods and services, is not so automatic like when it happens when we're establishing the interest rate on bank funds, like the federal funds rate. Tradable goods are not always perfect substitutes in different countries. Why? Because there's different tastes. Something that, like coffee. The coffee that we consume in Italy is not the same coffee that you consume in the US. It's not the same coffee they consume in Turkey. We have different kinds of types of coffee that we consume. So you can't just say, well, I'm going to import, Turkey coffee beans produced in Turkey to Italy, and everybody's going to like them and drink it. You're not going to bring Italian coffee and everybody's going to consume it in the US. There's taste differences between countries, which then also affects the arbitrage, right? That leveling of the price. So the prices are not always going to level. The purchasing power parity is not a perfect way to determine the exchange rate. And the real exchange rates do fluctuate over time. They do fluctuate because the price levels fluctuate between countries. And so the large and persistent movements in nominal exchange rate reflect the changes in the price levels at home and abroad, right? We can go compare the price levels that we had in 2022, high in the US. Not all the countries have had a higher inflation rate in 2022. They didn't have that increase in the price levels that we've had. Those that have had it, we have not had the same increase in the price level. It's been different in every country. So the purchasing power parity is not a consistent way to determine the real exchange rate, right? We can't say that a US dollar has the same purchasing power in the US than it will have abroad. So some of the implications are valid, right? So the implication that nominal exchange rates can change when the price level changes, yes. E equals P over P with the star. We know that. P with the star over P. This equation stands true, right? It's an implication of that power parity. But because this implication stands true, and because the price level changes differently in different countries, then that is the limitation. This identity does not mean that the US dollar has the same purchasing power in every country at every moment in time. Sometimes we can have the same purchasing power, and sometimes we might not. So it's not, a slam dunk. So this is all for chapter 18. It's mostly theory, as you can see, but if you have any issues with content, just let me know, and I will happily, go over it. If you need some time to meet with me on Wednesday, tomorrow morning, send me an email, because I can do a Zoom meeting anytime, probably 11:30ish to 1 o'clock. We can set up a time, and I'll be happy to go over anything that you want to do. I will see you back in class next week. I think it's November 8th. Let me look. On Wednesday, November 8th. I will see you back in class. I wish you a good weekend. And make sure that you, if you've come to the end of this recording, use this time. You can start working on the economics in the movies as a group. I've already posted it to the classroom, and you can access it anytime. It's due November 12th. Let me know if you have any questions, and I'll see you next week. Bye.